All right, welcome to the deep dive. You know how this works, right? We take those sources you send us, and we pull out the main points.
Yeah.
The good stuff, the insights that help you really grasp the topic.
Yeah.
Without having to, like, wade through every single detail.
We're not just summarizing, we're extracting the essence, the so what,
Exactly. Like, why should you care about this stuff?
Yeah.
And today, well, you've pointed us towards a thinker who's definitely made an impact, but often gets misunderstood.
Oh, yeah.
Friedrich Nietzsche.
Nietzsche, big name.
The text we're using as our diving board, so to speak, is this one called Nietzsche. Hope is the worst of all evils, for it prolongs suffering.
Wow. Straight to the point, huh?
Yeah. Now, I get it. Nietzsche can seem a little intimidating.
Yeah.
Even a bit,
Was he?
dangerous to some people, right?
That's understandable. I mean, his ideas, they've been controversial, to say the least.
Right. And yeah, unfortunately, sometimes twisted and used for the wrong reasons. So, look, we're not going to turn you into Nietzsche scholars in the next hour or so.
No.
But we are going to try to get to the core of what he was saying, understand where he was coming from.
The context.
Yeah, and maybe clear up some of those misconceptions floating around.
Right.
This source we've got, it gives us a good overview, touches on his life, his big philosophical ideas.
And why he still matters.
Exactly. Why he's still relevant today.
Even after all this time.
Okay, so right off the bat, the source jumps into how Nietzsche saw himself, the whole history of...
A philosophy.
Yeah, like where did he fit in?
Yeah.
And it lays out this kind of progression. It says first, you had this period after the early Christian thinkers where
philosophy became like almost too comfortable.
Right, it settled down. The ideas of Aristotle, as interpreted through the church, were like...
the dominant force.
Yeah, the accepted truth. But then, boom, the 17th century hits.
Uh-oh.
And you've got Descartes coming along saying, I think, therefore I am.
Oh, yeah, Descartes, big emphasis on reason.
Right, this huge focus on pure thought. And that really...
shook things up.
Big time. But then, that sparked a reaction.
Right, for sure.
Yeah.
You had the empiricists in Britain.
Like Locke and Hume.
Yeah, Locke Hume saying, wait a minute. All knowledge comes from experience, not just thinking about it.
Right, from our senses, from what we observe.
Exactly.
And the source suggests this almost went too far in the other direction.
Right.
Like, philosophy was in danger of becoming just this catalog of sensations,
Yeah, just listing what we experience without any deeper meaning.
Okay, so we've got this swing from pure reason to pure experience. Seems like philosophy was trying to find its footing.
Absolutely. Looking for solid ground.
And then along comes Kant at the end of the 18th century.
Kant, another giant.
He famously said he was awakened from his dogmatic slumber.
He felt like philosophy had become too complacent, too accepting of things without question.
Right, so he tried to bring those two approaches together, reason and experience, into this massive new system.
Yeah, his own grand philosophical framework.
Okay, then you've got Hegel building on that, another huge system.
Hegel, trying to understand the whole of history and human consciousness.
And then, according to the source, Schopenhauer throws a bit of Eastern thought into the mix.
Schopenhauer, a bit more pessimistic, right?
Yeah.
More focused on the darker aspects of existence.
Introducing this idea of a blind, irrational will driving everything.
Yeah, a will, but not necessarily a good one.
So we've got all these big systems, these big thinkers trying to explain the world, the universe, and everything.
Yeah, a rich philosophical landscape.
And then Nietzsche comes along,
Right.
enters the scene, and the source describes him as making philosophy dangerous again.
Oh, yeah. But this time, not just for academics.
Right. For everyone.
His philosophy was a challenge to the way we think about, well, everything.
Yeah.
Morality, values, the meaning of life.
Yeah. He wanted people to question everything, to reevaluate their most fundamental beliefs.
He wasn't afraid to shake things up.
Okay, now we got to remember, the source mentions this too, that Nietzsche did eventually.
Yeah, he had a breakdown.
He suffered from mental illness, and you can see glimpses of that in his later writing. But these core ideas, these disruptive ideas, they really took shape before that period.
What's fascinating is that the source suggests that while Nietzsche's ideas didn't come from his madness,
Right.
they almost foreshadowed a kind of societal madness.
Oh, wow.
The kind that led to those terrible events in the 20th century.
It's like his philosophy in some ways reflected the darker potential within human nature.
And the source even hints that those ways of thinking could reemerge.
Which is a scary thought.
It is. Makes you think, doesn't it?
Okay, so it sounds like we need to dig a little deeper here, go beyond those surface level ideas. And, the source doesn't really present his most well-known concepts.
Like the Übermensch.
Right, the Übermensch, the eternal return.
This idea of civilization existing just to produce great men.
Right, and Nietzsche even kind of put himself in that category.
He did have a pretty high opinion of himself.
But the source doesn't really see those as his greatest contributions.
No, not necessarily.
It even touches on his idea of the will to power.
Yeah.
Which he kind of used as this universal explanation for, well, everything.
Like a grand theory of everything.
But it doesn't sound like the source is entirely convinced by that.
No, it actually calls it either simplistic or meaningless.
Oh, wow. Okay, so if those famous ideas aren't what the source considers his real brilliance, then what is it?
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The source says Nietzsche's true power wasn't in proposing the will to power as a grand theory, but in using it as a tool for analysis.
Oh, I see.
It was like a lens to dissect and expose the hidden motivations behind our actions.
Okay, so it's not just about everyone wanting to dominate each other. It's about using this idea to understand why we believe what we believe.
Exactly. Why our societies are structured the way they are.
So he's not trying to build a new system. He's trying to
deconstruct the old ones.
Right, to see what's really going on underneath.
To uncover the power dynamics at play beneath the surface of our morality and our social structures.
That makes a lot more sense than this idea of everyone just wanting to be the boss.
Right. It's much more nuanced than that.
Okay, now the source also spends some time on Nietzsche's personal history.
Yeah.
And it really emphasizes how his life experiences shaped his philosophy.
His background is crucial for understanding where he's coming from.
So he was born in Saxony, which was part of Prussia at the time, and his family had a history in commerce, but both his father and grandfather were
Lutheran pastors.
And his father was like super patriotic, a huge admirer of King Friedrich William IV.
So much so that Nietzsche was actually named after him.
Right. And then there's this kind of unsettling detail that the source mentions. Nietzsche, his father, and his grandfather. They all died with some form of mental incapacity.
Oh, wow.
So there's this family history of mental illness.
It definitely adds another layer to understanding his life and maybe his anxieties.
Absolutely. And then the source paints this picture of his upbringing. It was a household dominated by women.
A house full of women.
His mother, sister, grandmother, and 2 aunts.
Wow.
And they're described as, kind of troubled.
Oh, really?
It was a very intense environment.
And very religious.
Yeah.
That kind of strict, pious upbringing.
And it's interesting, the source suggests that this early exposure to that kind of,
that a very specific type of female influence.
Right.
It might have shaped some of his later views on women.
Yeah, like his sometimes pretty harsh criticism.
Especially towards certain types of women.
Right. It gives you a glimpse into those formative influences on his thinking.
Makes sense.
Okay, so at 13, he goes off to this prestigious boarding school, Forta, and he excels there. They even nicknamed him Little Pastor.
Oh, wow.
But even at that young age, his intellect leads him to start
questioning his faith.
Yeah.
Around 18.
And he increasingly felt like an outsider, the source says. And it seems like this internal struggle was largely a solitary one.
He was more influenced by his own reflections than by a wide circle of friends or colleagues. Throughout his life, actually.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So that kind of sets the stage for his time at the University of Bonn, where he initially goes to study
theology
and classical philology.
Following in his father's footsteps.
Yeah, fulfilling those expectations of the holy women back home.
Right. Becoming a pastor.
But that plan doesn't last long.
Not at all. The source describes it as an unconscious desire for rebellion.
Oh, interesting.
And he really embraces university life.
Like full on?
Joins a fraternity, starts drinking, even participates in a duel.
Whoa, a real duel.
With the traditional scar to prove it.
Sounds like he was making up for lost time.
Maybe a bit performative.
Yeah, maybe. And it's during this period that he famously declares, God is dead.
That's a powerful statement.
It is.
Yeah.
But the source reminds us that it wasn't actually original to Nietzsche.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Hegel had said it a couple of decades earlier.
Interesting.
So it shows that Nietzsche was engaging with the philosophical ideas of his time.
Reacting to them.
Exactly. And his refusal to take communion back home and his decision to abandon theology.
Those were clear signs.
Right. And then he moves to Leipzig the following year and completely shifts his focus to classical philology.
So Leipzig was a turning point.
Big time. He turned 21 there.
Yeah.
And the source highlights two events that really
changed his life.
The first is this accidental, or maybe not so accidental, visit to a brothel.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The source is a little cautious about this episode because it relies solely on Nietzsche's own account.
Which could be a bit,
Embellished.
Yeah, potential.
He claims he was looking for a restaurant and somehow ended up...
in a brothel.
Yeah, surrounded by women in sequins.
That's a pretty big mix-up.
And then he says he played the piano and fled.
Played the piano and ran away.
Yeah.
Sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it?
It does. But the source suggests that despite his initial shock, he probably did visit brothels after that.
Okay.
And this leads to the second significant event, contracting an infection.
An infection.
Yeah. The source strongly implies this was syphilis.
Syphilis. Wow.
Even though a definitive diagnosis wasn't common back then because of the nature of the disease.
Right.
But regardless, this experience seems to have really impacted him.
How so?
It seems like he largely abstained from sexual activity with women for the rest of his life.
Because of this experience.
Yeah. And ironically, that didn't stop him from, making some pretty critical pronouncements about women in his writing.
That's interesting. A bit of a contradiction.
Yeah, definitely a bit uncomfortable. Okay, so then the other major event in Leipzig is his discovery of Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation.
Oh, Schopenhauer. That's a big one.
He finds it in a secondhand bookstore.
Just by chance.
Yeah, total serendipity.
Wow.
And the source describes this as a transformative encounter for him.
I can imagine. Schopenhauer's not exactly light reading.
He called it finding a mirror that reflected the world, life, and his own inner being.
Wow.
With terrifying grandeur.
That's quite an image.
And he immediately resonated with Schopenhauer's pessimistic view of existence. The idea that it's all driven by this
relentless, irrational will.
Yeah.
So this was at a point where Nietzsche was grappling with the loss of his religious faith.
Right. He needed a new framework to make sense of the world.
And Schopenhauer provided that, but it wasn't a cheerful one.
No, definitely not. But the source also points out that Schopenhauer's pessimism didn't ultimately align with Nietzsche's own...
with his own tendencies.
Yeah, like he had this more life-affirming side, too.
But the concept of the will, that was crucial for Nietzsche.
It was the seed that would eventually grow into his own idea of the
will to power.
Okay, so after this intellectual awakening, he has this brief stint in the Prussian army.
Oh, yeah.
The source kind of describes it with a touch of humor, considering his lamentably fragile physique.
He wasn't exactly built for war.
No, not really. But he did have an impressive military mustache, apparently.
Well, at least he had that going for him.
And he even got promoted for bravery before being sent home due to injury.
Oh, wow. So he was actually in combat.
He had a riding accident and was hospitalized.
So much for the military career.
Yeah. So he returns to Leipzig, and his professor calls him the most brilliant student in 40 years.
Wow. Hot praise.
But Nietzsche's interest in philology was starting to fade. He found it too detached from...
in real life.
Yeah, from the true and pressing problems of life, he said.
So he was feeling a bit lost.
Yeah, he even considered studying chemistry or embracing a bohemian lifestyle in Paris.
Quite a shift.
And then he's introduced to Richard Wagner.
Richard Wagner. Now that's a name that carries some weight.
And the impact was immediate, almost overwhelming, the source says.
Really?
Wagner was the same age as Nietzsche's deceased father.
Oh, wow.
And apparently they even looked alike.
Interesting.
And Nietzsche, who the source suggests, had this deep need for a father figure.
Yeah.
He had never encountered a famous artist before.
So Wagner was like this larger-than-life figure.
And Wagner was also a huge admirer of Schopenhauer.
Creating this instant connection.
Yeah, this intellectual bond. And Wagner, flattered by the attention of this bright young philosopher, he reciprocated with his charisma. And the effect on Nietzsche was...
profound.
The source even says he was suffocated by the great composer.
Wow. Wagner's personality was as big as his operas.
Just 2 months later, Nietzsche's offered a professorship in Basel.
At 24.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Without even a doctorate.
That's incredible.
Astonishing achievement. And even though he was having doubts about philology, he couldn't refuse the honor.
I get it.
And in Basel, he's conveniently close to Tribschen,
right.
Wagner's estate.
Oh, right.
Where he lived with Cosima, Liszt's daughter.
Liszt's daughter. Wow.
and Nietzsche becomes a regular weekend guest at this opulent villa.
I bet.
The source really paints this vivid picture of Wagner's life there.
What was it like?
Extravagant, almost theatrical.
Like an opera?
Yeah, kind of. Like, rose satin walls, busts of Wagner himself, commemorative silverware.
Wow.
Incense filling the air, and only Wagner's music was allowed to be played.
No other music?
No, just his.
Oh, wow.
Cosima orchestrated everything, even managed perfumed pet lambs and huge hunting dogs.
Perfumed pet lambs. That's a new one.
It sounds like a performance,
Carefully constructed.
Yeah, and it's hard to imagine Nietzsche, the serious philosopher, being totally taken in by all that.
Right.
But the source suggests that Wagner's music and his personality had a real hold over the young Nietzsche.
He was still impressionable.
Yeah, and the source calls him immature Nietzsche at this stage.
Oh, okay.
And Wagner was this father figure he craved.
Right.
But the source also hints at maybe a deeper attraction to Cosima.
Ooh, a love triangle.
But it seems like Nietzsche didn't even fully acknowledge those feelings himself.
Right. Complicated stuff.
Okay, so then in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War breaks out.
Oh, wow.
And Nietzsche, full of patriotic fervor, he volunteers as a nurse.
A nurse, not a soldier.
No, a nurse. And it ends up being another pivotal moment for him.
Really? How so?
He's observing these cavalry troops heading to the front. And he has this epiphany. He realizes that the strongest drive in life isn't just survival.
It's something more than that.
Yeah, it's this will to power, a will to war and domination.
Oh, wow. So that's where the will to power comes from?
Initially, yeah. It starts with this very military connotation.
Makes sense in that context.
But then the romanticism of war quickly disappears,
Reality sets in.
Yeah, he confronts the horrors of the battlefield.
The casualties.
The human remains, tending to the wounded. It takes a toll on him.
I can imagine.
He returns to Basel pretty shattered by the experience.
Understandable.
But he throws himself back into teaching and starts writing The Birth of Tragedy.
The Birth of Tragedy, another big one.
Yeah, it's his analysis of ancient Greek culture.
And it introduces the whole Apollonian and Dionysian dichotomy.
Right, the Apollonian being order, reason, harmony, and the Dionysian being those primal instinctual forces.
Like chaos, ecstasy.
Exactly. And Nietzsche argues that the fusion of these two elements created great tragedy.
Which was later destroyed by an overemphasis on rationalism.
Right, too much Apollonian, not enough Dionysian.
And he used Wagner as an example of this fusion, right?
Yeah, he saw Wagner's music as embodying that same spirit as the Greek tragedians.
So Nietzsche was making a connection between ancient Greece and his own time.
Exactly. He was using the past to critique the present.
And this focus on the Dionysian, it becomes really important in his later philosophy.
It's like a counterpoint to Schopenhauer's pessimism and to Christian values.
He saw those as life-denying.
Right, to focus on controlling and suppressing our instincts.
He wanted to embrace those primal forces.
And the source points out that this emphasis on the darker aspects of Greek culture was controversial at the time.
Oh, yeah. Why is that?
Because the classical world was usually idealized, seen as this perfect model of reason and beauty.
He was challenging that idealized view.
Yeah. He was saying, look, there was this darker side to it too, and it was important.
Interesting.
Okay, so we've got this growing tension between the Apollonian and Dionysian.
And Nietzsche saw that reflected in Wagner's music.
Yeah, initially. But then their relationship starts to break down.
Oh, really? What happened?
Nietzsche starts to see through Wagner's persona. Yeah.
The cracks start to show.
Yeah. He sees his ego, his less admirable qualities.
Like his anti-Semitism.
Right. And Wagner's admiration for Schopenhauer, even that starts to seem self-serving to Nietzsche. And then there's this pivotal moment in Bayreuth.
Where Wagner was building his opera house.
Yeah. Nietzsche attends the opening of the Ring Cycle in 1876. And he becomes very ill.
Oh, no.
The source even suggests it might have been psychosomatic.
Like his body was rejecting the whole thing?
Maybe. But the scale of Wagner's ambition, the whole spectacle, it just becomes too much for him.
He had to get out of there.
Yeah, and 2 years later, he publishes Human, All Too Human.
Which was?
It's the collection of aphorisms, these short, insightful statements.
Oh, okay.
And it effectively marks his break with Wagner.
How so?
Well, it praises French art. It's full of psychological observations, and there's no mention of Wagner's music at all.
That's a pretty clear message.
Yeah, and Wagner couldn't handle it.
Ouch.
And ironically, this book also alienates some of Nietzsche's own followers.
His own followers. Why?
Because of the very things he's admired for today. His language and his writing style.
His writing style, what was so different about it?
He adopts this aphoristic style.
Aphorisms, those short, punchy statements.
Yeah, he moves away from that traditional systematic philosophical writing.
Oh, interesting.
And the source even connects this to his habit of taking long walks and jotting down his thoughts.
So his writing style reflected his way of thinking.
It was like these bursts of insight.
And this was influential.
Hugely. The source even claims that Nietzsche's prose foreshadowed the linguistic revolution of the 20th century.
Wow. That's a bold claim.
It is.
But it makes sense. I mean, aphorisms are all about getting to the point, being concise and impactful.
Exactly. And despite this fragmented style, the source argues that Nietzsche's work is not unsystematic.
Oh, okay.
His ideas still have coherence, even without that traditional structure.
So there's a thread connecting them.
Yeah.
And human, all too human, it really showcases his psychological insights.
Right. The source gives some examples, like the distinction between a fantasist and a liar.
That's an interesting one.
The idea that the mother of excess isn't joy, but the lack of it.
I never thought about it that way.
And he even describes witty sayings as epitaphs for dying emotions.
That's pretty poetic.
Yeah.
And these observations, they were influential.
The source says they were so profound that Freud supposedly stopped reading Nietzsche because he was afraid of having nothing left to say.
Wow, that's a big compliment.
It is.
So Nietzsche was a significant figure in psychology.
Yeah, even though he didn't have a lot of social interaction.
He's kind of a loner, right?
Yeah, the source says he was very solitary.
But he was a keen observer of people.
Especially Wagner.
Oh yeah, Wagner, that makes sense.
Wagner was like this complex, larger-than-life figure.
A perfect subject for his psychological study.
Right, and the source acknowledges that Nietzsche's insights might have come from that close observation of Wagner.
But he was also self-aware, right?
Yeah, to a degree, but maybe selectively self-aware.
We all have our blind spots.
That's true. Okay, so the break with Wagner after Human, All Too Human, was inevitable.
Their paths were diverging.
Nietzsche was moving further away from traditional morality, while Wagner...
Drawn back to Christianity.
Yeah, with his opera Parsifal.
So they ended up on opposite sides of the spectrum.
Okay, so in 1879, Nietzsche has to resign from his professorship in Basel.
Because of his health?
Yeah, his health was deteriorating. He had been frail for years, and he was now seriously ill.
What kind of illnesses?
The source lists deteriorating eyesight, severe headaches, just a general state of physical distress.
Wow, that's rough.
And he starts traveling all over Europe, looking for a better climate.
Trying to find some relief.
Yeah, he spends the next decade wandering through Italy, southern France, Switzerland.
A nomad philosopher.
And the source describes his collection of remedies as remarkable.
Remarkable, like a lot of strange cures.
Yeah, apparently.
Even for a philosopher.
Even for a philosopher.
But despite all this, he still came up with the idea of the Übermensch.
Right. And the source acknowledges that maybe there was an element of psychological compensation in that idea.
Like, he was projecting his own desire for strength and health onto this idealized figure.
Maybe. But it's still a central concept in his philosophy.
And it makes its grand entrance in Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Yeah, which is this long, very serious, and often pretty dense...
poetic work.
Right. It's not an easy read.
But it's very influential, especially among younger readers.
The source says it's got this powerful call for independent thought.
Even if that thought leads to some uncomfortable conclusions.
Exactly.
And the source quotes some pretty striking lines from Zarathustra.
Yeah, about the death of God and the implications of that.
A huge shift in human history.
And the source points out that the French existentialists later explored similar ideas.
But in a less dramatic way.
Right. Less poetic, more grounded.
Okay, so we've got this wanderer philosopher writing these intense works, and then he meets Lou Salome.
Oh yeah, Lou Salome.
A fascinating character.
She was a young Russian woman, and the source calls this the beginning of a rather inconceivable love triangle.
Inconceivable? Why is that?
Well, for that time period, it was a very unconventional arrangement.
So it was more than just a love triangle.
Yeah, they initially envisioned this intellectual ménage à trois.
A ménage à trois. Wow. Dedicated to philosophical pursuits.
That was the idea.
Ambitious.
Yeah, but then both Ray and Nietzsche.
Paul Ray was the other philosopher involved.
Yeah. They both fall for Lou and propose marriage.
Oh, wow.
And Nietzsche even asks Ray to propose on his behalf.
Really? That doesn't sound like the best strategy.
Yeah, the source even points out that it kind of undermines Nietzsche's claim of being the greatest psychologist of his time.
I see what you mean.
And there's that famous photograph of the three of them.
The one where they're pulling Lou in a cart.
Yeah, and she's holding a whip.
Wow, a pretty clear symbol of power dynamics.
Right. And in the end, the whole thing falls apart.
As you might.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.